Common errors of relevance. When you engage in critical thinking, you're interacting with a set of claims about a problem or issue. Your task is to assess those claims individually and as a whole to determine whether the argument is right or wrong, strong or weak. You should not judge an argument by external factors, such as the person making the argument, or try to critique an argument by appealing to an inappropriate standard, which means a standard other than reason or logic. As you've learned, you need to make sure the premises are relevant to the issue at hand, but relevance can come into play in other ways when evaluating arguments. You need to make sure that the standards you apply when evaluating premises are relevant. So, for example, is a person you cite as an authority really an authority? Or is the fact that things have always been done a certain way the right standard to use? In this episode, you'll learn more about the common ways in which assessing irrelevance is brought to the practice of evaluating arguments. The first type of error, focusing on the source. In an earlier episode, you learned about the importance of evaluating the source of a claim. Knowing where a claim came from is part of assessing its truth or acceptability. The source of that information, whether it is a fact or opinion, is a factor that can make the claim more or less acceptable. However, there is another source that is irrelevant in your evaluation: the source of the argument itself. Now, here we're making an important distinction that may be tricky, so please pay close attention. A premise, an individual claim that is part of an argument and is used to support a specific conclusion, has a source that is relevant. Knowing whether the premise was arrived at by research that meets the standards of the scientific community, or if it was made up by someone with no expertise who stands to earn a lot of money if you accept the premise, matters. On the other hand, it is not relevant to your analysis of the argument who presents it. If you criticize the argument by criticizing its author, you are committing an ad hominem error. For centuries, any argument made by a woman was dismissed automatically, not on the merits of the argument itself, but because it was made by a woman rather than a man. On the flip side, it's an error to accept an argument simply because you like or respect the person making the argument. Even if you have good reasons to trust that person, you should still subject their argument to the same critical analysis you apply to arguments from others, examining the premises, the conclusion, and the relationship between them. This guideline goes for arguments made by well-known authors that are read for class, and also for arguments made by your professor. Second type of error, using an irrelevant standard. Remember, when you evaluate an argument properly, you use reason and logic to assess the claims being made. Sometimes we fail to use proper standards in our analysis. Instead, we may rely on common ways of thinking or acting that, in essence, provide a sort of shortcut. These shortcuts are really tempting in that they allow us to get away from the heavy work that critical thinking requires. Because these alternative standards for analysis may reflect commonly held beliefs or practices, we don't always see the harm in relying on them, rather than thinking critically about an argument. There are a number of examples of these irrelevant standards. One is tradition. Many people will judge an argument to be acceptable because it fits with what we've always believed. Traditions are a widespread and important part of social and cultural systems. But that does not mean we can blindly rely on them to assess an argument. It's unreasonable to ask a person to defend a particular tradition, to give one or more reasons why he or she thinks that tradition is a good one. If reasons can be provided, then those reasons themselves form a justification for the argument. But the tradition itself is not a justification. If the reasons for following a tradition are judged to be unacceptable, then just saying, "but it's tradition," is not a valid standard for accepting an argument. Another similar and equally irrelevant standard is custom or common practice. Just because a recommended action fits with the way we've always done it, does not mean that action is acceptable. Similarly, Sometimes people defend their claims by saying, well, everyone does this, or thinks that. Appeals to popularity are not relevant ways to evaluate a claim or argument. A related error is the two wrongs fallacy. Just as overall popularity or majority rule doesn't necessarily make something acceptable, the fact that someone else did it doesn't make an action right. The same thing goes for habits. Defending an action or claim by saying, it's just a habit I have, does not fit with the requirements of critical thinking. Imagine a friend tells you that she always misses her early morning classes. When you ask why, she says, I just got in the habit of staying up really late, so I have to sleep in and then I miss class. When you critically assess her argument, you need to interrogate whether there is some logical or valid reason for staying up late. The standard of, it's my habit, is not relevant. A third type of error, going off topic. The final group of relevance errors involves going off topic. When someone goes off topic, he or she brings issues into the argument that have absolutely no place there. Sometimes this is done deliberately in order to divert attention from the real relevant claims. And sometimes it reflects a lack of knowledge. The person making the argument doesn't really know what the issue is about, and out of ignorance, they bring in claims that are unrelated. One example of an off-topic approach is the red herring, an irrelevant claim that serves as a distraction from the issue at hand. The claim may be introduced unintentionally due to confusion about the issue or argument being debated, or it may be brought in on purpose. Either way, a red herring is an irrelevant claim that takes attention away from the relevant pieces of an argument and makes the task of evaluating the argument much more difficult. Another example of getting off topic is a non sequitur. Non sequitur is Latin for it does not follow. So non sequiturs are claims or premises that don't actually follow from the preceding claim. For example, consider the following argument. All people who live in Boston are Red Sox fans. You are a Red Sox fan. Therefore, you must live in Boston. Assume that the first premise is true, that all people who live in Boston are Red Sox fans. Does the conclusion that you live in Boston really follow from the premise that you're a Red Sox fan? No, the argument states that all people who do live in Boston are fans, but it does not state that all Red Sox fans live in Boston. The conclusion does not follow from the premises given. Non sequiturs are often errors in logical thinking. To conclude, you'll often analyze existing arguments and make arguments of your own. In both instances, you must be aware of whether you're using relevant premises and standards to evaluate the arguments of others or to craft your own. You should be attentive to when another person is introducing irrelevant issues or standards into an argument, or applying such irrelevancies when he or she analyzes your argument. The task of critical thinking is challenging enough without being overburdened trying to understand the elements of an argument that aren't even relevant.